Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the March edition of our learning event. And today's topic is something that we've all been looking forward to, right? I wasn't here in December, but we moved from December to March, and hopefully we have the same speakers. So, we should be expecting quite the interesting evening tonight. And the topic is gentle persuasion, understanding the power of the written word in shaping our opinions and beliefs. And we have Dr. Sam Weissrock with us. She has a PhD and master's actually in industrial organizational psychology from Walden University. She also has a master's in interdisciplinary studies and Bachelor of Continuing Studies from Indiana. Dr. Weissrock has served as editor of the Indiana University Southeast Graduate Review Journal and presented at the Midwest MIS Conference. Her presentations include the impact of media on men and masculinity, the effects of psychosocial support on the goal attainment of men in impoverished communities, and the influence of perception of equality in academic studies on the intersection of gender and leadership. Quite an accomplished, but we're going to let you talk to us, right? Tell us more about yourself and what you have for us this evening. So I'm going to hand over the microphone to you right away.
Perfect. Everyone can see my screen okay?
Let me stop sharing. Yes. Yep.
And now? Perfect. Awesome. Well, before I get started, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for being here tonight. This is truly a privilege and an honor for me to come to you all and talk about what is my passion. In the presentation as we speak, I really have not gone so much into my gender studies, but if there's time at the end and you all would like to talk about what my research is, I am happy to do that. But tonight, I really want to just talk about really how language, especially in the written word, can shape our opinions and beliefs. So as we get started, I like to call mine gentle persuasion. And the truth is because when I was writing my dissertation, my chair would not allow me to use that as my title. So now is retribution. I'm always using that as my title of my research. So I hope we have a little bit of fun along the way. And as we get to the end, please feel free to ask questions. So about me, and thank you, Dr. Otito. As I was introduced, I blend psychology, technology, and science, and my goal is to create a positive social change. My research really does focus on gender equality. And when I say equality, I'm looking at all genders, not just the biological sex of women or of men, but really how do we make a more inclusive and cohesive world? So again, we can talk about that at the end. I'm currently a professor of healthcare leadership at the University of Louisville. My career has taken me down the path of nonprofit work and healthcare. So that is a lot of my passions and love is with underserved populations, that the folks that don't get always enough attention. I do have a doctorate and a master's in industrial organizational psychology. My emphasis is more on the organizational aspect rather than the HR aspect. I also have a master's in interdisciplinary studies from Indiana University. I also have coaching certificates in neuro leadership, and I'm actually missing a class tonight to be here with you all. So they're anxiously awaiting, okay, not so anxiously, but they're waiting for me after I finish. So, and then last but not least, I am a strategic organizational consultant. And what that means is that when I work with leaders, they're looking to change their organization in massive ways. And sometimes it's very easy to stay here, and I help them look up and over so they can accomplish those long-term goals that align with the company mission and their personal missions. So that's a little bit about me. So now I ask you, please, what was your road? What did you travel? How did you get here tonight? Of all the ways you could have spent your Pi Day, Tuesday, you chose to spend an hour with me. So just take a second and think about what it is that brought you here and what you're hoping to accomplish as we talk tonight. So whatever your roads are, mine's different from yours. Yours is different from mine. I'm going to use some examples. They may grate on you a little bit, but I had to choose something. So you might not like what you hear. You might totally cheer for what you hear. I just ask that you're open-minded and just know that I really struggled as I was going down this path myself to try to understand how I was showing up as a person and as a leader at work. So whatever your path is, we do intersect, because at the end of the day, we are all just human beings being human at work. We are social creatures, and we're looking for ways to connect and to understand one another, whether you are like me or not like me, in group, out group. So just also keep that in your mind as we go through this next roughly hour together. So as we get started, this is my jam. This is what gets me excited, gets me going every day, is I love looking at the science of how we think and internalize what our experiences are. I love analyzing what we read and how that plays into what we expect and experience in our lives and what we believe and what our biases are, and how those things all together, how we're wired, what we consume, and what we're taught can come in and create a self-fulfilling prophecy in ourselves, in our community, and the people we work with. So if you would like to join with me a little bit, we're going to talk about each one of these topics, and then I'm going to bring them all together at the end in these self-fulfilling prophecies. So that being said, let's start with science. Science, neuromania. Neuromania is a thing. If it has neuro in it, it's popular. We have neuroscience, we have neuropsychology, we have neuro, fill in the blank. Neurolinguistics is the area of science of how our brain translates language. That is a very large and robust area of work. We're not going to really talk about that tonight, but you can read it. I'm happy to give you some literature on it, but it tells you where in the brain language is processed. It is close to the areas we're going to talk about tonight, but there are other factors that go in. So really what we're looking at is this idea of neurons that fire together, wire together. Donald Hebb was the person who really introduced that concept. And basically what it is saying is that neurons are information messengers, and they use electrical impulses to take the chemical signals and wire them together. The more we think about something, the harder that's going to get. That's going to become like a magnet. If we can change the thought, we can weaken that. If we change the thought over and over again, we can break it. If we keep thinking something different, we can wire something new. That's what your neurons are doing for you every day and every moment of your life. There are different areas of the brains that perform different functions. And there are different areas of the brain versus the nervous system. So as we're going through our days and going through how we're looking at language and processing and what we are consuming, think about how much of your brain you are using. And when I say using, I mean really using. Let's talk about the brain. The brain is an amazing thing. One of my favorite parts I've got. One of the things that was really hard for me is understanding and remembering where the brain parts were. So I like to flip your lid. So what it is, if you put up your hand, put your thumb in and wrap it around. So this out here, that's your prefrontal cortex. That's the part of you that is called the executive functions. It's your decision making. It controls parts of your language and your speech, and it is pleasure and planning for the future. That's your forward thinking brain. Your limbic system, right in here, that is your collection of brain structures that is unconscious. It's the part of you that you're not really thinking about. It's the stuff that we really wouldn't, if we're thinking about neuroscience, we want to get into that zone, because then we can let more new things come into the prefrontal cortex. So we're constantly trying to take what we learn and move it back here and make it automatic. The basal ganglia is about repetitive behavior. So that's where we learn and our habits are formed. And it's also, where addictions are made. So think your basal ganglia if you like your wine at night, like I do. So you got that. Then the other thing, it is about a 2-inch section at the stem of the brain. That's called the reticular activating system. It does not roll off the tongue, so I refer to it the RAS. The RAS is the gatekeeper. It basically is telling you what your unconscious mind connects to your conscious mind. And I hear often people say, Sam, I would like to think. And I know you would like to think. But the fact of the matter is, you're not usually thinking with the part of you that goes really into decision making. You're working with the back of the brain and the remainder of the brain and the parts that connect into your body. And you're not, except more or less on autopilot. So the flip your lid, very, very helpful. That's what helped me get through a lot of certifications and classes. So there you go. So as you're thinking and as we're talking, keep that literally and figuratively in your mind. When we're talking about the areas in my research that get me going, I'm really looking at how the brain is going to process this stuff. And so I love analyzing what we read. And you can say, Sam, why what we read? Why are you not talking about spoken language? Well, as I got into the work that was passionate to me, which was these messages I was hearing about how women are at work and how men are at work. And as the mother of a son and as a daughter, I was like, well, I didn't like what I was hearing because I want both my children to succeed. I want to succeed, and I want my brothers and the men in my life to succeed. So I started looking at this, and I learned that when we're looking at communication theory, this poor guy with a terrible last name came into understanding or showing the infographics. We see a lot about infographics, and that's because the brain can pick it up and translate it very, very quickly. And the brain is always looking for shortcuts in how it is processing work or processing language. So when you think about this, there's 93% of what we consume in the way of language is based on things other than the word itself. Only 7% of communicated words actually align to the word that is spoken. And I'll get into that a little bit later about how language is structured and the symbolism behind it. But if you think about this, if only 7% of your workday and the communication that you have, you are judging on the fact of what is verbally being communicated to you and what those words mean, what is happening in the rest of your day? It's the conversations you're dealing with. It's the facial and body expressions of the people that you're working with. But what about all those one-pagers, your emails, the articles you're reading, the work that you're reading that tells you how do you do DEI at work, the articles you're reading because you're in your MBA at night. How is that language affecting you? And that's how I came into this idea of really wanting to understand how we internalize and process language when we are consuming it by ourselves in the sanctity of our own home, where we have nothing more than the book and ourselves. Are we really alone? So what I did, if you really want to geek out and you want to do what I do, it's called critical discourse analysis. And you can be the light of the party or shut it down in a heartbeat. And people are always fascinated when I start talking about the work that I do, especially when I'm out, because I do take a very different aspect from what you hear in mainstream media. Critical discourse analysis is a type of analysis that is both a framework and a methodology. One informs the other, which is, if you've done research studies, you know that that is somewhat unusual. And the reason is because critical discourse analysis is so heavily tied into social act that you really cannot do one without the other. And explores how language can be used as a way to shape your beliefs, to legitimize your thoughts, and to sustain an ideology, what you think, or to tear it down. That is one aspect of it. It also suggests that language is reinforced and it can legitimize and manipulate both the ideas of the writer and the reader. That was something that was just an aha moment for me as I was going through with my undergraduate, and I was being given all this material of things I was supposed to read and to write on as a critical thinker, but I was not critically allowed to go and choose my own articles. So that's when it really became home to me. It's like, what am I consuming and how is this shaping who I am as a person? So the next part about critical discourse analysis is that it must have a social problem. So if you get into this, and this is why it's so timely for where we are in the world and the type of work that we do, it is going on all of the things that are of interest to us. It looks at sex, it looks at race, it looks at gender, it looks at social economics, it looks at equality or equity. You can really take this and look at it from any specific item that you want and get a different perspective. And what is really unique about critical discourse analysis is I don't just get to have an idea. I have to come up with some sort of solution or some sort of answer to that social problem. So I will give you some books at the end if you're interested in learning more about critical discourse analysis. But you can see here that it really does go, and there are many different approaches that we can use that all centers around that ideology, but it also leans heavily on political discourse and educational discourse, and how do those all intersect? So that brings us to what I consider the fun part, language. Language is something that we use every day, but we don't often think about. Language is basically structured communication through symbols. And I think that is the biggest thing you can take away from this. Whatever you are reading, it is based on a symbol or an idea of what you think and believe that word means based on the area that you grew up in. Some words can trigger you. Some words can pass by. Some words may be your second language, but that fact that language is symbolic is something that's so important, that the idea of a cow in America can be dinner, where in Hindu, it can be a sacred animal. So these are things that when we really think about how we are communicating, if we can get outside of our norm, we really can open up a world here. The other thing is grammar is the entire or whole structure or system of language. It includes your lexicon, your structure, your syntax, your rules, which are your semantics. That is grammar of itself. One thing that we really want to think about here is what's called a linguistic strategy. A positive or a negative linguistic strategy is where they use a positive or negatively weighted word, such as only, which can suggest that what follows is unacceptable. You don't think about that. However, see what I did there? We reconstruct and we can reposition what we're wanting our reader, our consumer of information, to take away based on the words that we are saying. And that leads me to the next bigger part of language, the secret life of clauses. You have a word, and that word can be strung together in sentences. And those sentences can be strung together in paragraphs and into a story. And those larger bodies are called clauses, and it's a subject and a topic, and it's followed by a predicate or a comment. And how a clause is structured will shape the perception of the reader and of the writer. But we're looking really of the reader at this point, what I'm considering us. The main clause is considered the focal or the foreground, and it's what is considered to be argued or asserted as the information. The subordinate clause is the one that sits in the background. And it's the one that's supposed to be information. It's what is assumed or taken for granted. And the last one I think is really big because it comes up a lot in my line of conversations at work is lexical density. It's basically where you read that paragraph and you have to read it so many times because you don't understand it. That's because it's written for someone with a special type of knowledge that you don't have yet. So you're having to read it over and over and over again to get that knowledge in your mind and to have it make sense. And you say to yourself, well, Sam, what does that mean? Let's go with an easy one. If we're looking at a clause, a short one, we can say Sam is related to Zach. In this sentence, I am at the forefront and Zach is related to me. If we only flip a sentence and say Zach is related to Sam, it puts Zach as the focal point and Sam as the background. But no matter how bad this boy wants it, I am always going to be his mom. But the way that we have structured this sentence is leading or guiding the consumer to make a decision on what information is important. And the structure here is actually making, in the first instance, me is more important. And the second one, Zachary is more important. And in the latter of us are the background information, what is assumed to be information that is shared. Let's talk about the old switcheroo. This one's bigger. This one is where lexical density really comes into play, and how sentences are structured in what we consume really can shape our opinion. This one here is, or two sentences. They literally are flipped front to back by the comma. And the first one, if you look at it, what is being asserted is that despite a large percentage of Mexicans speaking citizens, the last part is that English remains the national language of the United States. In the second one, it's flipped. It only says, is now putting English as the national language of the United States. And in the background, saying despite a large percentage of Mexican speaking citizens. Now, as a writer, you are unintentionally putting what you're considered to be new information first, and the assumed knowledge to be second. However, as a consumer, I have to make decision based on what you're giving me of whether or not I agree with it, I disagree with it, or totally hate it. And if I totally hate it to enough, it will trigger it from the back of my brain, take it through the limbic system, into the RAS, and then allow me to put it into my prefrontal cortex, where then I can start making decisions on that information. If it does not offend me or make me passionate in some way, it will sit in that back area and just become additional information, which over time will become a stronger neuron that will then become something stronger in your belief system. Again, I remind you, some of this stuff I really struggled with myself as I was going through and learning this. It grated on me because I thought maybe I should know better, but it's part of being a human being. The next one, and this is one that is also very near and dear to my heart, although the next one I think is my favorite, is we talk about shared meaning. If you're going into a critical discourse analysis, it's called dialectical relationship. And these are language, linguistic strategies and language constructs that are used to shape meanings. And a good one is like making sure that we're all on the same page, which I just did there. I used a shared meaning through a metaphor. We now assume that we're all on the same page. What is the page and what book are we in? So assumption of knowledge basically says that when I say a word, I'm assuming that you know what I mean by that. And this is one of the ones that really blew my mind as I was going through learning about this, is what I took for granted and what people knew, especially in corporate America. For example, CEO positions available to Fortune 500 companies is 500. I would often, that was part of my early research, is asking people, could they articulate to me what a Fortune 500 company was? And the fact that most people that I worked with and encountered, even in a Fortune 50 company, could not tell me the difference between a Fortune 500 company or another one. If you're not aware, basically a Fortune 500 company is based out of the United States and is one of the top 500. And there's a formula that's used in both calculations of how their culture and their finances, most heavily on the finances. Of Fortune 500 companies, there are only 500 CEO positions available throughout the entire world in a Fortune 500 company. So when we're all struggling for that top brass ring, or we're looking to hit that top, it's important to question, what does that top mean? Because if we really are looking at the upper echelons, there's only 500. So these are things that are shared meaning. And I thought it was pretty cool as I came along with it. It came into this information. There's a lot of other metaphors that we take for granted, such as glass floors, sticky ceilings, glass labyrinth, and a lot of sports metaphors that also come up in linguistics as well. So something to look into when you have a boring Saturday with nothing else to do with your life. The next one, this is my actual favorite one, textual silences. Here it says that Colson Whitehead said, what isn't said is as important as what is said. As much as I like Colson, he is actually not the first person to study this. This came from back in earlier research that came into linguistic studies of Foucault and Fairclough and others early on. And I believe it was Fairclough that actually did say that what is not said is as important as what is said. And basically, it is what is looked at as omitted information. When you are omitting information, the brain has to fill in the gaps. And it's going to fill in the gaps based on information that you know personally, or that you've read, or that has been told to you. So if I say something to the effect of only 44 women are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, I now have put this onus back on you as the consumer to decide, okay, I know that there are 500 jobs available. I'm going to assume 44 women of CEOs is unacceptable. And I'm going to fill in the blank of what those other people who have those roles are. Our default is hetero, straight, white men, but that's not always the case. There's 4% of the population, I believe the last time I checked, it was Asian. And there are many other demographics that we could look at. We can split it any sort of way between sex, gender, familial upbringing, political affiliation. So basically what I'm saying to you is that when we talk about textual silences, this is where I, as a human being, and I, as Sam Weissrock, have to really sit down and think about what it is I think and believe, and question how I'm filling in those blanks. Otherwise, I'm just still going into the back of my brain and filling it in with what I think I know. Last but not least is historical reliance. Historical reliance is where I look at old information and use it to sustain a current ideology. That's a very fancy word for saying I cite something that's old. And when you're getting into citations and into academic research and educational research, and even into popular publications such as someone like Brene Brown, who has taken her doctoral work and converted into paperback novels, paperback books. This is where you have to go. It's important to go back and look at how we are citing and gathering our information, because as researchers, it's very easy for us to go into this snowballing, or going into social networking and looking for unintentionally work that's similar to our own, or work that sustains our own. As a matter of fact, in my my interdisciplinary studies, I actually had a professor tell me to write what I wanted and then find citations that supported my argument. This is something we don't always think about. So historical reliance is very important, especially if you're looking in the DEI world. Go back and look at some of the underpinnings where they're threading over time to see whether or not we are actually evolving in our conversations, or just relying on something that happened 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And if you're interested in more information, I'm sharing my contact information at the end. You can reach out to me, and I'm happy to give you lots of different things that you can go look at for yourself. So that brings us to the next part of expectancy. Experience, beliefs, and bias. That's all what rolls up into expectancy. And what's really very interesting is that people generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for. I have seen this so many times, time and time again, where your brain fills in the blanks, and suddenly you are processing information based on what you thought someone said, or what you thought you read, instead of what actually is on the paper. So those fall into two different categories: beliefs and biases. So we want to think biases are bad. A bias is basically the tendency to interpret information as a confirmation of information we already know, our beliefs or opinions. Biases are natural. They affect every decision and every act we make in our life. It is basically that experiences that we've had in the past, or the information that we are told, that allows us not to be eaten, that allows us to understand whether or not something or someone is dangerous, or that someone or something is good. A great example of this is in-group and out-group. If you're looking in how teams work together, innately people are going to look for people who are more like them, and as opposed to people who are not like them. This is true at the lowest levels of organizations, all the way up into the C-suites. C-suites especially, have something like this because the responsibility that they have of making sure that the company stays together and the company is functioning and creating the profits, they will tend to find people that they feel that they can rely upon because their values, their work ethics, and sometimes even the way they look and behave resonates with who they are. They can be used poorly, but they also are a survival mechanism. So think about that. I am biased. I have biases. I acknowledge my biases. I even acknowledge that I am biased against my biases, and I don't always see them. So that's why I call them blind spots. But they are there, and they're there for a reason. What they are as a cognitive bias is it's our brain's attempt to simplify information processing. So what this is called is a strategy of the brain called heuristics. It is a mental shortcut. And that mental shortcut says, based on what I know here, I'm going to say this seems very much similar like it. And so it's going to let me go very quickly into this new area. So if you look at something like Beam's schemas, that's where you're going to get into that, where I'm going to start making connections based on something I already know that I have validated as true in my head. That is a bias. The fine difference between a bias and a belief, it seems very slim, but is very big, actually. A belief is an attitude about how the world is supposed to be or how it is. That would be the difference between being biased towards someone of another color versus a belief of that's just how the world is. Those are the differences. We can do this with any sort of, I am biased to people of poor social, lower social and economic statuses. Our belief might be, it's just the way it is. The rich get rich, the poor get poor. You can see the differences between the two. So, beliefs and biases, they are so close, but much like the Olsen twins, they are not identical. One is the tendency to seek out and interpret new information to confirm pre-existing beliefs and opinions. The other one, it occurs when a person has incorrectly assessed an argument to conclude and basically to support their current ideas. But what's important in all this is that both come from prior social experiences. And this is where I come back to my earlier point. We are human beings, whether we're in the confines of work, the confines of leadership, the confines of HR or DEI or whatever has brought you to here today. We are all here together because we're trying to understand our social experiences. And what does all this mean? Well, coming back to how the brain is. If you walk around with these beliefs and these biases from messages that you've heard, read, or consumed, as Henry Ford said, whether you think you can, or you think you can't, you're right. You can tie this into spirituality. There's a lot of metaphysics. There's a lot in Christianity. Every religion has this. And then, as we've talked about, our brain wires that way. If you think about it long enough, it will become your truth. And that's where self-fulfilling prophecies come into play. Blue cars. Blue cars are fun. The reason I say this is my mind was blown when I started looking at this phenomenon of the RAS and what it can mean. The RAS is basically this idea of what you think you see, you will see. So one day I heard about the blue car phenomenon. And the idea is, if you think to yourself, my goodness, everyone I see seems to be driving a blue car these days. Suddenly, your brain will notice and seek out blue cars. Don't believe me? Try it. You can do this with blue shirts. You can do it with orange sunglasses, whatever you want. The redheads in the world. Pick a topic and go, gosh, I see more of those. And suddenly you're going to find that you see more of them. The next day or two, switch it and say, oh, goodness, everyone's driving a red car. And see how many red cars you notice is compared to your blue cars. Again, this is where these ideas that we have, what we're thinking and how we are using our brain that we aren't really using at all, the information in our background goes through the RAS because we allow that gate to come up and put it into the prefrontal cortex. So now we start seeing that again, and then we start creating these ideologies that then start persuading our belief systems. And then those become our truth. Because as they say, when you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. If you think what I said was not true, go back and read this sentence again. You probably read, like I did the first once or twice, when you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. That's what your brain filled in. The truth of what you read was, when you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. And the reason the brain did that is because of all the things that we've been talking about and how the brain fills in based on what it thinks it's going to see. So I'm going to wrap this all up. And I'd like to thank you all for being here. I've got a couple more slides, but as Mr. Kimmel here is telling me I got to wrap things up, is the number one thing I can tell you as you are consuming is think about the authorship. Whatever you're consuming was written by someone. And if it's someone like me, the number one thing they told me when I went into this line of work and to be who you is sitting before you is to pick a topic that was passionate to me, that I was willing to spend years of my life on and work through it in the moments that made me sick, the moments I wanted to scream, the moments I wanted to throw it against the wall. If you read Brene Brown, the moments where she sat with all of her sticky notes and just wanted to throw up. That is the dedication it takes to write publications, to write articles. We get so many no's. I did so many no's as I was going through a lot of research, hundreds of articles, hundreds of books, and probably hundreds of edits. There's a lot of rejection that goes along the way. The other part is data collection is time consuming and expensive. One of my favorite authoresses, there's a group of 5 ladies that they did some fantastic work. And the first time I read an article, I was amazed. By the time I got to the 4th one, I was still amazed, but they had used the same data and sliced it from a different angle because it takes so much time and money to collect data. So they will use the same data over and over again. And the data are going to be just repositioned and framed differently to get as much mileage out of it as possible. Another thing to note is that there is so much research out there that is not available to the public. I learned that along the way as I was going through my own work, and that there's so much out there that you cannot possibly read it all. Another thing to note is it is incredibly lonely. Sometimes people, when I talk about PhDs, I'm like, come talk to me. It's a lot of lonely time, a lot of time in their head. And so that's when your biases and your beliefs can come into play as writers, as consumers of information, and as people who are writing these types of articles. So the thing I would also like to point out to you all, if you have that favorite author or authoress, remember that careers are shaped around a specific topic. We can look at Maxwell. We can look at Simon Sinek. These are actually all my books behind me. We can look at Daniel Pink. There's a whole bunch of them up here that are really written around what dissertations are about. What we do, as I said, we look through the data through multiple lenses. As many times as data can be used, it will be used. Another thing that is very important to note, and I cannot stress this enough, is if you are looking at something that is the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 9th edition, please go to the front, find out when it was originally published, and look at the articles that are contained in that edition. You may be surprised. I had one that I was very excited to have some fantastic articles that were published in 2022 that I was going to analyze, only realized that 75% of them were 1960s and 1970s rebranded and packaged into something that was 2022. So take that in consideration. Next thing that I would suggest to you as you are reading and consuming information and as you are sharing with others, again, I don't make this in a vacuum, but remember that in academia and in publications, we can only suggest. We add to a body of work. We cannot say we have solved anything. So as we are working on our topics and we're talking about things like my love being of gender and leadership in the workplace, and I look at it holistically from many different aspects, other people may choose a different sliver of it. And that's because we have to in order to be able to publish anything or to get through that dreaded dissertation. And then also something that's really interesting to note is that just like in the workplace, just like in your classroom studies, if you were in an adult learner or in college, there are informal social networks where many times authors are writing together. They're publishing together. It takes so much time. There's so much money involved. You've got to get participants. So social networks come into play, and all those go into research and authorship. So there's so much that I've shared with you on critical discourse analysis, self-fulfilling prophecies, how we process language, but also remember at the end of it all, that remember someone wrote it, and you're really reading is a written conversation with the writer. You are having a conversation with someone you're not going to meet. You're only having a one-sided conversation, and your brain is going to fill in what you believe that they're trying to say, whether you agree with it or whether you do not agree with it. So whether or not this feels good, I'm going to keep it back in my limbic system, everything is good, everything is groovy, or this feels icky, oh my gosh, it's got to go through the RAS, I got to get into my prefrontal cortex, and I've got to do something about that. Also remember, what is not written is just as important as what is. If you are looking at something that is talking about equality, and it is talking, let's say, some things I can share that I'm reading articles and it tells me that 300% of participants and 62 of those are women. My brain is going to fill in what I think the other ones were. And based on what I've read or thought thus far, I will fill them in by race, by color, by sex, by social economic status, by anything, by the criminal record, by whatever my brain is going to fill in the blanks, usually by what's been primed to me as I'm reading the abstract. Another big thing is that as researchers, we can only add to, we cannot say for sure. So you're going to get mixed messages. You may read one article says that Sam is fantastic, where you read another one that says Sam is terrible. Both can be right and both can be wrong based on how they're looking at Sam. We also tend to trust research on nonfiction writing, meaning that because I write nonfiction and I am a subject matter expert in neuroscience, linguistics, healthcare administration, leadership, blah, 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 all those things you know about me, you trust me because I've got, as my son says, Mama, you got letters in front of and behind your name. So yes, you trust me. I know what I'm talking about. And something I didn't like when I learned is that what does not support what is being researched typically does not get published. So if you heard 15 people say that Sam Weissrock is terrible, and we found 50 people that did not support that and that said she was fantastic, that research would never see the light of day. Very rarely does it. And last but not least on this slide is mainstream publications is where it is at. So when you're reading something, if you wanted to read my 300-page dissertation that is full of hyperbole, juxtaposition, big words, accurately cited, blah, 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 that's one of my discourse voices. And I have not even touched on a discourse voice. But if you were to say, I read Sam's research, and then you've heard me speak, you would say, is that the same person? Because you're getting a different aspect of me. And this is a different venue. And this is a different setup of the whole thing. So that's why you'll see a lot of people who are doing research and then turn that into publication to make it more palatable and understand to the layperson. So as I wrap it up, remember, we rely on the weight of our experience. We focus on what we can see. We trust our circle of advisors, especially in writing, and we overvalue our own experience. This is a citation from Sawyer and Hogarth of HBR, talking about how we make decisions and solve problems. Fooled by Experience, which I thought was a fantastic read. and really can give some fantastic insight to you. It's also very different than if you were to read their published articles that has been put into academic journals. But as I said, for most folks, that is very difficult to get to. But if they do, they have to pay for it. So last but not least, I want to share a little bit more about me. I asked you as we started, before I flipped to the slide, I asked you when we started. I shared about who I am and what I do, my credentials, and why I'm an expert in all this. And I asked you to think about your own journey and why you showed up here today. And we've talked about a lot of really amazing, complicated things. We're all trying to figure out how do we help people at the workplace, and how do we manage perceptions and solve some of the real challenges in this world. So I want to share that I have told you a story. It is a story, but it's mine and it's true. So let me tell you about my road. My road is that I am the first generation in my family at everything. I grew up in a large, poor family. I actually am one of 15 children. I am middle child at number 8, 7 above and 7 below, 5 of which are adopted. I have 2 Black and 1 Mexican sister. And we come from a very large, very strange family. Fundamental Christian upbringing. My father had an 8th grade education, who was an amazing man. My mother was mentally ill, physically abusive, and mentally abusive. By the time I was 19, I was married. By the time I was 22, I had 2 children, and I was single. I slept in my car more than once with them. I sold food stamps, and I was every American cliche. I did not go to college until I was 42. I did not earn my master's in interdisciplinary studies until I was 45. I then went on to get my doctorate, my master's and my doctorate in IO psychology. We can stop telling how old I am now. There's so much more to my life. So ask yourself, what do you think about me now? What would have you thought about me if I was giving you this information and you knew this up front? Would it have changed how you were consuming the information I've shared about how your brain works, how you process information, how your bias and your beliefs come into play, how the language you consume is shaping your ideologies, and whether or not you respect people that write nonfiction work? It's something to ask yourself. And I would be very, very curious to know, would you have thought more of me or less of me? Would I have inspired you, or would you have never showed up? These is where I will end my presentation, but I want to say thank you. Here is my contact information. I do have a website that I'm working on. Please be kind. It's not fully finished, but you are more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to hear from you. And if we have a few more minutes, I know we got about 10 left. It looks like there's 12 comments. I can't see if they're questions or not, but just remember to be nice. And then I also have some readings that I'm happy to recommend for you on neuroleadership, language itself. I love Deborah Tannen, who was one of my first people who really brought me to this topic. James Paul Gee, who does great accessible work on critical discourse analysis. And Luann, I love her because she writes on how the male brain and the female brain works. And I have apologized to both my children, a son and a daughter, telling them, had I known these things, I would have parented them differently. So on that note, stopping sharing. Is it okay?
You get a standing sitting ovation from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It has been my pleasure to get to speak to you all tonight. And in the last few minutes, what questions do you have? What feedback do you have? Anything I could, just questions. Let's start with a question or two.
Yeah, I've been monitoring the chat. It's just basically people adding to the conversation.
Yes.
But I put a question in terms of just, many of us are in L&D.
Mm-hmm.
At least we're trying to, move organizations forward or people forward through training and development.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you had to do with the idea of training materials, right? Because while the way I think about it sometimes, and I've had, so part of what I do is editing, like
Mm-hmm.
a developmental editor for a lot of work that people do, there are always conversations in these groups about making it as simple as possible, right? Making things as simple as possible. But I always say to them, I said, what about the audience? There's some people for whom the simplicity, not to conflict the word simple, right? But if you make it too easy, a person who has had this very high levels of education is probably going to be upset. Like, it's almost like it's too simple for them. Like, so how do you strike the balance?
Yeah, that is actually a great question. And so when we're going back into when I was talking about the language structure of language, and you're getting into the grammar and the syntax, and I was talking about the clause worth of informations. So when you're writing, even at a higher level, if you're giving sentences that are overly cumbersome, that has strings worth of information over and over and over again, go into GE if you want to learn more about how those are weighted. The brain actually has to expend higher energy. And so you may be interested to know that my writings and expertise is in healthcare administration, healthcare leadership. We actually write even to doctors at a 9th grade level because they need to be able to focus on those keywords.
Okay.
So the language around that concept, that idea that you need them to grab on, you can give the definition, you can give that more complicated information, but what's surrounding it, let the brain rest. Let the brain focus on that definition or that critical component of that language that you need to communicate to them. Yeah. So, yeah. So it really, even familiarity with topics, I think the folks on their phone today, you probably read a lot of research, and sometimes it feels like if you just turn the book upside down backwards, it reads better. So that's what when you're doing is your brain is just being overly processed and overly engaged by what it's having to consume and translate.
Okay. And that's because, I guess with those kinds of things, people are at work, right? They're already engaged, and you want to make it easier for them in that sense, right? As opposed to,
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you're trying to let their brains be on everything else, because even when you're reading, the idea of task switching, which is a real thing, you need to let that cognitive load be as less as possible. Yeah. Hi, Paul. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just kind of building on the last question there. I went through a training a year or so ago, and one of the required readings was this book on trust. And it was interesting. Again, this is all my experience, my opinion, but kind of to your point, it was written by a couple of academics, and it was a celebration of the work that they had done, and certainly the volume of content and the vast complexity within which they were able to portray it was a testament to their work, and yet completely alienated me, because the whole book really could have been covered in one chapter with much less words. And so I ended up, I didn't read the book. I got about 2 chapters into it, and then I read the first paragraph of every chapter that followed, just so I could say, yep, I've been through the book.
Absolutely. Or the key insights in the back of the chapter. I've done that one too.
They didn't even do that.
I know, it's not even worth it. No, and it's true. And these are the things, because if the academics, so what you guys got tonight, you men and ladies, you are experiencing about 15 years worth of my life. You got in an hour. My dissertation is 300 pages long, 276 articles I audited. I have, I think, 54 books. I had to get special permission to do my research, and you got the samified version, right? The one that's the fun version. The other part, when I read it, is hyperbole. I just am like, oh my God, I've become what I hated. But that's the tone that they call that the discourse voice. And our discourse voice, and Otita and I were talking about this the other day, is that we have things that she and I can come in common with, because we both have a discourse voice of, we both have PhDs, we're both female. However, I have white, she has color. I don't know her heritage or background, but you now know that I have something in the car with my kids. Paul, that's something maybe you can't relate. Becker, something you can't relate. Maybe some of you can go, I got you, girl. But that's where our voices will come into play, especially in the types of topics that we go into. I spend a lot of time researching gender equality with men and women. And why could that be? If I am objective about it, it's because what did I say I had at the end? I had a dad that was great, and I had a mom that could have used some help. So I don't have maybe some of the narratives that other people would have. And that's what I learned very early on. It brought me into this type of work, was sitting at an office table in a meeting, realizing, what is that book? Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten was really true.
But Sam, I have to acknowledge the work that you do and all professionals like you, because I can sit here as a consumer and bitch about complicated stuff, but let's use a different analogy, right? At the end of the day, the consumer just wants the cell phone so they can get on with their life, right?
Absolutely.
But somebody still has to be the scientist, and someone still has to know how to do the math. Even if as a consumer, I don't necessarily ever want to see that, at some point in time, there's going to be some point in our society or our circumstances or what have you, where all the shortcuts aren't going to be accessible anymore.
Exactly.
And we're going to need to depend on the person who did the research, knows how to do the math, understands the science.
Exactly. And in this presentation is part of my heart, but it's very different. I could have given you all a morning on each one of the components that we talked about, because there's so much to just even the subliminal messages that subliminal is not right, but the way that we internalize what we're reading, of what we recognize, and how that just continues to go into our brain. But to your point, like if you're looking for something with trust, you want trust. You throw off all the other stuff. Give me trust. But maybe to Sandy, who I see on the phone, doesn't care about trust. They're looking at Drive, Daniel Pinker. So I don't know if you guys can see all the books behind me, but you're looking at a totally different topic. So you're looking at, that's where, I need to talk about what's going to be the drive. I don't care about trust, but what are the drivers of people. So that's where I think as leaders, and especially even if what I have spoke about didn't really resonate with you, like as training and things like that, what I hope it brings to you is this idea of awareness of what am I seeking out to substantiate what I am writing. Is there a different perspective that I am leaving out of this training, this magazine article, this research? What is that other slice, or other, just can I take a half step to the left? Mm-hmm. And that can really change and open up for it. I mean, I tell you, I have been doing this for a long time, and I've only had one person who did not like my comments. I've only had one person, and and everybody said, don't listen to her, she didn't like anything. So
well, hopefully that will not be
it was not the case
from one of us. Yeah.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Again, I know we're at the top of the hour. I do appreciate your all's time, especially coming back. When we had the little glitch in December, to come back today to listen to me. If you have any questions, I'm that person. I love to talk about this type of work. I lead in large organizations. I'm here. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I believe my email address is in the handout. I did not put my cell phone number on there. Sorry, but you feel free, and I'm happy to share as many resources and help you get closer to your goals a little faster than it took me. Mm-hmm. So
thank you,
Sam.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Take care.